Hi, my name is Kara Dickel, and I'm a student at Morningside College, and my study was on the effects of rubrics on elementary art students' creative self-efficacy. The problem statement was that the problem of assessing students in the area of art is a topic of continuous debate among teachers, administrators, and educators. While assessing students in art is necessary for teachers to gain insight and evaluate ideas, there are many who view art as a special activity for elementary students to enjoy partaking in. One means of authentic assessment is through the use of rubrics. I was curious to find if assessments in art hindered creativity and how assessments in art affected my students. Through the literature review, I found two themes, that rubrics improve engagement and then rubrics also improve achievement. Results from the Artful Learning Project indicated that improvement in student engagement and the quality of art making, as well as students embracing formative assessment. Mason and Stady in 2006 found that using rubrics helps simplify art incorporation into the curriculum. And for improving achievement, positive effects and increased academic achievement with the use of rubrics was the outcome of a study conducted in 2015. And in an experimental study conducted by he and Canty in 2012, results suggest that participants who used a rubric to complete their assignments performed better than participants who did not. The purpose of my study was to discover if rubrics improve students' creative self-efficacy. The students in both groups were pre-tested and post-tested using Bandura's 2006 self-efficacy scale, as well as Karwowski's 2011 short scale of creative self. Independent samples t-tests were used to compare the two groups on both the pre-test and post-test. The participants were 36 fifth grade students. 36% were white, 61% African American, and 2% Hispanic. We had 47% that were girls, while the remaining 53 were boys. 16% had an IEP, 25% participated in our ELL program, and 71% of the students received free and reduced lunch. The groups were randomly selected by homeroom class. For the materials, we used a variety of clay tools, clay, drawing tools, a Prezi presentation on the history of coil pots, as well as smartboard technologies. The procedure involved both groups learning about the history of coil pots through our Prezi presentation. We spent 5 weeks and 54 minutes per week in the art room with each group. The experimental group used the rubric and reviewed the rubric at the start of each class. The rubric was also available throughout the duration of the class for students to reference at any time. The students or the participants in the control group did not have access to the rubric until the project was complete. The findings did not support the hypothesis that using a rubric throughout the duration of the 6-week coiling project would increase self-efficacy and creative self-efficacy. If you look at Table 1, the independent samples t-test results for the pre-test and post-test on self-efficacy and creative self-efficacy show no statistically significant results. The figure 1 are the means and standard deviations for self-efficacy, pre-test and post-test data for both the control and experimental group. And figure 2 shows the means and standard deviation for creative self-efficacy for the pre-test and post-test for both the control and experimental group as well. Connections to the past research and theory. There's really little research that's been done on the integration of authentic assessments in elementary art. There has been an ongoing debate on how to accurately assess the subject of art, and challenges are present on how to fairly assess the visual arts. Taylor 2014 implies that art cannot be assessed because of its individual and subjective nature. Furthermore, Taylor suggests that art is about creatively solving problems, being inventive, and our own unique form of expression. Hager challenges our ability to count the feeling we get from art on an assessment and indicated that there is currently no valid instrument to account for our reaction to art. Shively, Stith, and Rubenstein in 2018 note that creativity is multidimensional, and the current rubrics that assess it do so unfairly by combining creativity with neatness and appearance. In 2009, Young confirms the notion that rubrics suppress imaginative thought and generate an atmosphere of rigid standardization to assignments. Lowenfield and Britton in 1975 suggest that the art room should be the only place in school where marks do not count. In contrast, Mason and Steedley in 2006 found that rubrics are a useful form of assessment in the art room and help to promote collaboration between artists and educators, support teacher planning, and help students evaluate their work. While using a rubric throughout the duration of our COIL project with the experimental group may have increased the awareness of expectations, the collaboration between the students and myself was more redundant. Instead of exploring a more creative means to complete their project or pushing my students to explore, I felt that the student collaboration accounted more for what the rubric's requirements were. Providing students with a rubric throughout our COILing project may have given them insight on how they could have evaluated their work, but it also seemed to stifle their creativity as they seemed more concerned with the requirements of the rubric as opposed to the joy of creating. According to Bandura in 1993, a major function of thought is to empower people to predict events and develop ways to control events influencing their lives. In theory, the use of rubrics in elementary art education could enhance students' sense of self-efficacy by providing them with predictable outcomes within a lesson. Bandura in 1993 suggests that self-efficacy is increased when desired accomplishments are reached gradually. Having the rubric on display throughout the study with the experimental group was meant to allow for gradual feedback and give students the opportunity to evaluate themselves along the way, thus improving self-efficacy. Extenuating gains enhances perceived self-efficacy, while highlighting deficiencies weakens the influences people use to self-regulate, which causes a more negative performance. Students in both the control and experimental group were asked to complete the rubric after they had completed their COILing project. The rubric included 4 questions about the history of COILing. If students did not remember the answers about the history of COILing, the rubric may have accentuated their shortfalls. This could have negatively impacted their sense of self-efficacy, which in turn could have negatively impacted both their perceived self-efficacy and creative self-efficacy scales students completed immediately following the rubric. So implications for my study for students were involved finding ways to inspire creativity in the art room. Some of these were a researcher, Ellen Winner, and her colleagues studied art classes for a year in Boston. They concluded that when art teachers taught through the 8 habits of mind, creativity was increased among their students. One habit of mind named stretching and exploring was the equivalent of creativity. Stretching and exploring involved teachers encouraging students to take risks, to not be afraid of making mistakes, and learning how to take advantage of errors instead of simply telling students how to perform a task. Exposing students to creative works, establishing an environment in which unique and creative work is valued, and encouraging students to be inquisitive and exploratory are more ways to inspire creativity among students of all ages. An implication of this study for art educators is that rubrics may not be the best means to assess all student artwork. While a rubric may be beneficial for some, it may be counterintuitive for others in their creative process. Other means for assessment in the visual arts include sketchbooks, portfolios, demonstrations, writings, discussions, critiques, exhibits, and self-assessments, and art teachers need to do their best to determine which assessment fits best with each project. For administrators and curriculum directors, it may be beneficial to provide art teachers with further trainings and workshops on assessing student artwork. More research needs to be completed to help art educators find the best means for assessing students in the visual arts. Limitations and recommendations for further research included students only attended art once per week with me. The limited art time could possibly hinder the continuity of research. Each week, students spent time reviewing the previous week's work and were reminded of the project and expectations. After about the second week, some students tuned out the review phase in which the researcher reviewed the rubric. This may have led students in the experimental group who used the rubric throughout the duration of the project to tune out its content and expectations for its use. To control for this, future research should be conducted in a setting where students are exposed to art on a more frequent and consistent basis. This may help keep students engaged in the project. Another limitation to the study was that the researcher only studied 36 fifth grade students. The use of the rubrics throughout the course of the project could have a different effect on various grade levels. Since the sample size was small, it was challenging to gauge the study's true effectiveness. Future research could include not only more students, but students from various grade levels to gauge if using a rubric has a different impact on lower or upper elementary grades. An additional limitation to the study was that the research was only conducted over the course of one coiling project and one art medium, clay. Some students enjoyed working with clay and found it easy to manipulate, while others preferred different mediums to express themselves. Future research could conduct a study over multiple projects in a variety of art mediums. Lack of knowledge or training on how to use an assessment rubric was another limitation of the study. Future research could allow time for students to learn how to use an assessment rubric and practice working with it in the art room. As discussed previously, the rubric itself was another limitation of the project because once again, upon the project's completion, students filled out the rubric, but also on the rubric there were the 4 questions about the history. And if students got those wrong, it may have negatively impacted their sense of self-efficacy. They then filled out the scales right after they filled out the rubric, and so it could have hindered the results a little bit. So in the future, it might be helpful for and more accurate to eliminate the questions on the rubric and have students only focus on their visual art piece. The statistical procedure used was another limitation to the study. Future research may account for this by using a repeated measures procedure. This way, comparisons could be made between both groups' dependent variables, while also controlling for possible pretest differences. This procedure would also show change from pretest to post-test. That's my study. I hope you liked it and enjoyed it. I enjoyed the research and everything. So have a great day. Thanks.